Tomorrow, the land that carried 4 generations of my family's blood, sweat, and history would be gone. Not just any land, Wingcrest Estate. 60 rolling acres of vineyard in the heart of Napa Valley, with the weathered stone house my great-grandfather built with his bare hands more than a century ago. People called it a legacy property. But to me, it was more than that. It was where my mother grew up. Where Kale and I used to race between the vines every summer, our bare feet stained purple from crushed grapes. Where every Sunday night ended around the old oak table, our laughter spilling out into the cool night air. And now it was slipping away. The city fog curled against my San Francisco office windows when my phone lit up. Kale Wynn, my brother. I hesitated. Kale never called unless he needed something or was about to drop a bomb. I swiped to answer. Kale? His voice came sharp, clipped, like a verdict he'd already decided. We're selling Wingcrest tomorrow morning. Contract signed. Closing set. Mom's moving to Bayview Haven in Sausalito. I gripped the phone tighter. Excuse me, selling? Mom can't maintain it anymore, he said, matter of fact. She gave me power of attorney last month. Redwood Capital's offering cash. This is the best deal we'll ever get. My pulse kicked hard in my throat. Redwood Capital. I knew exactly who they were. Kale, my voice was low, steady. Redwood buys heritage properties for pennies, strips the land, and sells it off to billionaires who won't even know our family's name. He let out a short, humorless laugh, the kind that made my stomach twist. Alara, you live in the city. You run your big company. You're barely ever around. This is a family decision. I stood, walking to the window, the Golden Gate Bridge glowing faintly in the distance. Before you sign anything, check the Napa County property records. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the faint sound of typing. Silence. Then his voice, confused, sharper now. It says Wingcrest is owned by Sunhaven Trust. What the hell is that? I let the words sink in before I answered. That is my company. What? I bought the estate 8 months ago. The silence that followed was so heavy I could hear his breathing change. You bought it. Yes. And before you hand it over to Redwood for a song, you might want to ask me why. Why in the hell would you buy Mom's house without telling me, without telling her? Kale's voice was climbing now, sharp and defensive. I turned away from the window, shutting my office door with a quiet click. Because, Kale, 8 months ago, Mom was 3 months behind on property taxes. The bank had already sent foreclosure notices. The irrigation system was failing. The wine cellar roof was leaking into the barrels. She was days away from losing everything. That's not, Mom never said. Of course she didn't, I cut in. Because she was too busy covering for you. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. What are you talking about? I closed my eyes, picturing Mom in her faded work jacket, moving crates alone in the winter cold. She sold her jewelry, cut her grocery bill in half, stopped heating the East Wing last winter to save on energy bills. Also, she could send you money when your company tanked. That's not Alara, that's. It's the truth, and you didn't notice because you didn't look. You just assumed she was fine, because Mom always pretends she's fine. For a moment, the line went quiet except for the sound of his breathing, heavier now, uneven. I didn't know. No, you didn't, I said, my voice softer but no less firm. But here's what I did. I paid off every debt, fixed the irrigation, replaced the cellar roof, brought the estate up to code. Then I put it into a trust so it can never be sold without my signature. Mom gets to live there as long as she wants, without a single bill to her name. He didn't answer right away. I could feel his pride and guilt wrestling in the silence. This is insane, he muttered finally. What's insane, I said evenly, is that you almost sold it to Redwood for $18 million when it's worth $25, and they would have paved over the vines before the ink dried. I heard him exhale, not in relief, but in the way someone exhales when the weight of their own mistake settles on their shoulders. Bayview Haven, he said after a long pause. The place I lined up for Mom. Also mine, I replied flatly. I own 7 senior living communities across California. Bayview is my flagship. She'll get the best care in the state when she chooses to go, not when we decide for her. His voice cracked. So you've been protecting her, protecting all of us. That's what family is supposed to do, Kale, but it works both ways. No more big decisions about Mom without all of us at the table. Understood? The pause this time was shorter. Understood. 2 days later, Kale pulled up to my San Francisco office in his dusty old pickup. I hadn't seen him in person for months. He leaned against the truck, hands in his jacket pockets, looking like he wasn't sure if this was a reunion or a trial. The drive to Napa was quiet, the kind of silence that carries 1,000 unsaid things. The road curved through rolling hills, the air heavy with the scent of oak and early harvest. When we turned onto the long gravel drive, Wingcrest rose ahead of us. The wraparound porch, the tall windows, the vines stretching like green waves toward the horizon. Mom stood on the porch, shawl pulled tight against the breeze. The second she saw us both step out of the truck, her eyes lit up in that way that made her look years younger. "Well, this is a surprise," she called out, her voice warm but curious. Kale went to her first, hugging her a little too tightly, like he was afraid she might slip away. "Hey, Mom," I followed, forcing a smile. "Thought we'd come together today." She hugged me too, her hands warm even in the chill air. "What's the occasion?" Kale shot me that silent your turn look. "No occasion," I said. "Just overdue for a visit." We moved inside, the smell of fresh coffee wrapping around us like an old blanket. Mom poured it into mismatched mugs, the same ones we'd used since we were kids. "The vineyard's starting to bloom early this year," she said, sliding a mug toward me. "You should walk it before you go." Kale cleared his throat. "Mom, about the house." Her brow creased. "What about it?" I stepped in quickly. "Nothing's changing. You're staying here as long as you want. No one's taking this place away from you." Her eyes softened, but she searched our faces. "You two have been talking." Kale nodded. "Yeah, and I realized I haven't been here enough. That's going to change." She reached across the table, placing her hands over ours. "I don't need grand gestures. I just need my children close. The rest is just walls and land." I swallowed hard. "It's more than that to me. It's home, and I'm going to make sure it stays that way." Kale's voice was low but steady. "Me too." The three of us sat there for a while, the only sounds the ticking of the old kitchen clock and the soft hum of the vineyard breeze through the open window. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it felt like the first brick laid in something we'd been missing for years. The following Sunday, I pulled into the Wingcrest driveway just as the late afternoon sun washed the vineyard in gold. To my surprise, Kale's pickup was already there. Through the open kitchen window, I heard the low hum of music and the rhythmic thunk of a knife on a cutting board. When I stepped inside, the scent of rosemary and garlic hit me first. Mom was at the stove, hair pulled back, humming an old tune our grandmother used to sing during harvest. Kale was at the counter, chopping carrots with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations. He glanced up. "Look who finally made it," he said with a smirk. "I'm on time." I shot back, hanging my coat. Mom turned, a wooden spoon in hand. "You're both here, that's all that matters." We set the table together, the long oak one polished to a shine, the good china we only brought out for holidays. Outside, the vines glowed under the fading light. Dinner started with polite conversation, the kind that fills space without touching the real things. But somewhere between the roast chicken and Mom's peach cobbler, the air shifted. Kale told a story about the time he accidentally backed Dad's old truck into the barn wall. Mom laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. I found myself laughing too, not because the story was new, but because it felt like the first time in years we were sitting at this table as a family, not just as people connected by blood. Halfway through dessert, Mom set down her fork. "You know, I've been thinking. When I'm ready, I might move somewhere smaller, maybe one of those senior communities with activities and friends. Kale and I exchanged a quick glance. We'd already agreed not to tell her who owned Bayview Haven unless she asked. There are some wonderful places like that, I said carefully. When you're ready, we can visit a few together. She nodded slowly. It has to be somewhere that treats people like family, not storage. Kale's voice was quiet but firm. You'll get nothing less. When the plates were cleared, we walked the vineyard together, the evening air cool and sweet. Mom strolled ahead, trailing her fingers along the leaves. Kale fell into step beside me. Feels good, he murmured. What does? I asked. He glanced toward Mom. This, all of us together. I didn't answer. I just let the crunch of gravel under our feet and the glow of the porch light say what words couldn't. 3 months later, the air in Napa had shifted. The vines stood bare after harvest, the nights were cooler, and the Sunday dinners had become routine, the kind you start looking forward to all week. We were halfway through a meal of roast lamb and garlic potatoes when Mom set down her glass of Merlot. Her eyes were steady, her tone calm but deliberate. I've made a decision. Kale froze halfway through passing the bread. About what? About me, she said simply. I'm ready to move to Bayview Haven. The room went still. Even the old refrigerator's hum seemed to fade. Mom, I began carefully, you don't have to. I know I don't, she cut in gently. That's the point. This isn't because I can't handle Wingcrest anymore, it's because I want something different now. Friends I can have coffee with every morning, art classes, a garden I don't have to weed alone. Kale blinked like he wasn't sure he'd heard her right. But I've always said I love this house, and I do, but I don't want to grow old here by myself. I felt a tightness in my chest, not from losing her to another place, but from realizing this was the first time in years she was choosing entirely for herself. I reached for her hand. Then we'll make it happen. Kale nodded slowly. And Wingcrest stays in the family, always. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. That's all I needed to hear. It was a crisp Saturday morning when we packed Mom's things. The sun had barely cleared the hills, and the light streaming through the kitchen windows caught in the dust motes swirling in the air. We didn't box up the furniture or the heirlooms, they stayed exactly where they belonged. Instead, we filled a few sturdy suitcases with her clothes, a stack of well-worn books, her knitting basket, and the photo albums she'd guarded like treasure. Mom moved slowly through each room, touching the backs of chairs, the cool stone of the fireplace, the faded banister polished by decades of hands. She didn't cry. She didn't linger too long, but every gesture felt like a silent goodbye. Outside, Kale loaded the last suitcase into the truck. That's it, he said quietly, as if speaking louder might break something fragile. The drive to Bayview Haven took less than an hour, but it felt longer. Mom sat in the back seat, looking out at the passing vineyards. I wondered if she was counting the rows, the way Dad used to when he drove us to school. When we pulled up, sunlight spilled across the entrance, white stone, blooming roses, and a walkway shaded by old oak trees. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh flowers. Residents greeted us as we passed, some waving, some stopping to welcome Mom like she was an old friend. Her apartment was bright, with a little balcony overlooking the gardens. A writing desk sat by the window, already bathed in afternoon light. One of the staff brought in a plate of fresh-baked cookies. Another dropped off a flyer for the knitting circle and the watercolor painting class. Mom turned to us, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled, not the polite, tired smile I'd seen too often in the last few years, but something lighter. You two have surprised me, she said. I worried you were drifting apart. Now I see I was wrong. Kale slipped an arm around her shoulders. We were wrong about a lot of things. I leaned in, kissed her cheek. But we got one thing right, we take care of our own. 6 months later, Wingcrest felt different. Not just the land us. It was early summer, the vines heavy with promise. On the back lawn, the long oak table was set for 20. White linen fluttered in the breeze, candles flickered in glass jars, and bottles of Wingcrest wine lined the table like proud sentinels. Friends, neighbors, and family filled the air with laughter and clinking glasses. Some had known our family name for generations, others were meeting us for the first time. But tonight, there was no divide. Mom arrived just as the sun dipped low, leaning on her cane but smiling like the queen of her own parade. The moment she stepped into the yard, the chatter softened, then rose again with warmth and welcome. She made her way to the head of the table, her eyes sweeping over the vines, the people, the home she had protected in ways even she hadn't realized. "This," she said softly, almost to herself, "is what I always dreamed Wingcrest would be." Kale caught my eye from across the table. There was no tension now, no walls between us, just quiet acknowledgement that we'd done the right thing. Dinner stretched long into the evening. As the last light bled gold across the vineyard, Mom tapped her glass gently. The soft chime silenced the table. "I want to say something," she began. "I know this land has been through a lot. I've been through a lot, and so have my children. But tonight, I feel like we've come full circle. This estate isn't just mine, it's ours. And it will stay that way as long as you two keep looking out for each other the way you've looked out for me." My throat tightened. "You have my word." Kale's voice was steady, and mine, she smiled, her eyes catching the last light of day. "Then I can sleep easy." Later, when most of the guests had gone and the lanterns swayed gently in the warm breeze, Kale and I walked the edge of the vineyard. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't bought the estate?" he asked. "Yes," I said quietly, "and I don't like the picture." We walked in silence for a few moments. Then he said, "I used to think the biggest thing you could give someone was money. Now I know it's time and attention and just showing up." I smiled. "Took you long enough." We both laughed, the sound carrying out over the rows of vines. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was guarding Wingcrest alone. It was late autumn when I found myself back at Wingcrest alone. The vines had turned amber and gold, their leaves drifting in the cool breeze. The house stood quiet, but not empty, never empty. I let myself in through the kitchen door. The scent of the old oak table, the faint trace of rosemary in the air, it felt like Mom had just stepped out to the vineyard. On the counter sat an envelope with my name in her handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, the three of us, taken that first Sunday dinner after everything changed. We were laughing, heads tilted toward each other, the vines glowing behind us. On the back, she'd written, "No matter where we are, we're home if we're together." I heard a truck pull up outside. Kale's voice carried in through the open window. "You walking the vineyard without me?" I smiled, tucking the photo into my jacket pocket. Wouldn't dream of it. We stepped onto the porch just as the sun broke through the clouds, spilling light across the rows. For a moment, everything was exactly as it should be: the land, the house, the promise we'd made. And as we walked side by side down the gravel path, I realized something. The fight to protect Wingcrest was over, but the work of protecting each other, that was forever.